Okay. Just gonna step aside. Okay, guys, please start taking your seats. We're about to get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our first LiPS of the spring 2024 semester. Our speaker today is Professor Melissa Checker, a professor of anthropology, earth and environmental sciences at the City University of New York. My name is Anna Demina. I'm a second-year PhD student here at Columbia's Urban Planning program, and I will be moderating today's section. I will begin with a brief logistical announcements before introducing our speaker. We are recording today's lecture, so please keep this in mind if you don't wish to record it. And after the presentation, we will have time for Q&A. Our Q&A session will start around 2 p.m. So that we will have enough time for everyone's questions. If you want to ask the question, please raise your hand and I will address to you. And please give everyone an opportunity to ask their questions and don't probably ask. With that, I'm delighted to introduce our speaker for today. Melissa Checker is the head H. Darn professor and chair of urban studies at Queen's College, and a professor in the PhD programs of anthropology and earth and environmental sciences at the City University of New York Graduate Center. The research focuses on environmental justice activism in the US, urban sustainability, and environmental gentrification. He is the author of The Sustainability Myth, Environmental Gentrification and the Politics of Justice, which won the 2021 Society of the Anthropology of North America Book Prize, and Polluted Promises, Environmental Racism and Search for Justice in a Southern Town, which won the 2007 Society of the Humanistic Sociology Book Award. Co-edited Sustainability in the Global City, Myth and Practice, and Local Actions, Cultural Activism, Power, and Public Life, and has published numerous articles in academic journals as well as mainstream publications. So please welcome Professor.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, good. Okay. Well, thanks to Anna for organizing this and for inviting me, and thanks to all of you for coming out on a cold day. So I'm going to talk mostly about the major findings from my book, which came out in 2020. And then towards the end, I'll do some updates from a quantitative project that I'm working on with some colleagues in New York. And so this book, this research that I'll be talking about is based on about 10 years of mostly participant observation, since I'm an anthropologist by training, and also some archival research in New York City. So I'm going to, let me just make sure I got the slides advancement thing down. Yay, okay. So I'm going to start way back in ancient times in 2012, right after Hurricane Sandy. And about 2 weeks after the storm had pummeled New York and New Jersey, I joined about 150 Staten Islanders at a meeting sponsored by the New York City Economic Development Corporation. The storm, for those of you who may not remember, had killed 19 Staten Island residents, and many were still without power. But that evening's topic was not disaster recovery, flood protection, or safeguarding residents from future storms. Rather, Staten Island's still shaken residents filled the St. George Theater that night to hear about a plan to build a Ferris wheel in St. George, the neighborhood adjacent to the Staten Island Ferry. The brainchild of then Mayor Michael Bloomberg, the wheel promised finally to realize Staten Island's potential as a tourist destination. The largest Ferris wheel on Earth, according to Bloomberg, it would be an attraction unlike any other in New York City, even unlike any other on the planet. And it was set to rise 84 feet higher than the Singapore Flyer, which held the record for the world's largest Ferris wheel at the time. They expected riders 24 hours a day. And next to it, they were going to build a 340,000 square foot designer outlet retail complex and 130,000 square foot hotel. So a handful of residents and small business owners, as well as union members, were in the theater that night, and they really applauded the development. However, most of the people that came were outraged by it, to say the least. And one by one, they stepped up to the stage and took the mic to voice their misgivings. Some of them pointed out that the project was set to be built in a floodplain, and they had just had massive flooding. And nearly everyone was worried that the project was going to increase traffic on Richmond Terrace, which is the main artery on Staten Island, on that part of Staten Island. Some question the economic value of the project, noting that other Ferris wheels had operated at a loss in other cities around the world. And those living closest to the site were particularly horrified, since it was going to be running 24 hours a day. So the CEO of the New York Wheel at the time stood at the podium and assured everyone that the structure was going to be designed to withstand 300-mile-an-hour winds and storm surges. In fact, he said that the wheel was going to serve as a buffer, so it was going to actually act as flood protection for the areas of the island behind it, and that it was going to be lit by LED bulbs. So they were considering it a sustainable project. And the outlet mall was also supposed to have 5 acres of green roof. So, of course, people were not mollified by these assurances that it was going to be a sustainable project. And they continued to contest the project, which actually ended up failing on its own, which is a very long story, but I can tell you why in the Q&A. In fact, it's still kind of, well, the developers, I think, are still in litigation over it. So the New York Wheel, the reason that I start with this is because, to me, it epitomizes some of the contradictions of sustainability and the sustainable city that I wanted to write about in my book. So most notably about maybe a mile and a half from where the wheel is. And this is Staten Island, for those of you who don't know where it is in relation to the rest of the city. That X is the St. George Ferry Terminal. And the wheel project would have been right about here. And the area that I'm mostly going to be talking about now is this area, which is known as the North Shore, which is about a 5-mile stretch along the northern shore of Staten Island. You can see it's very close to New Jersey here. It goes all the way up about here. And this area is called the Kilvan Cove, this water body here. Okay, so the North Shore of Staten Island, one of the activists that I worked with called it an industrial girls gone wild. And she said that because it's home to one of the largest ports on the eastern seaboard. So gigantic container ships stream along the Kilvan Cove, coming in and out. There's a picture of one of the ships. Diesel trucks, of course, are coming to and from the port all day long and all night long. And they're kind of moving along that area, which again has just a few major arteries, roadways. There's also, at the time that I started my research, there were 21 sites that were known to contain toxic chemicals, all of them sitting within 75 feet of residential properties. And these included two private waste transfer stations, a Department of Sanitation garage, a sewer treatment plant, an industrial salt company, and several bus depots. So all of these sites also sat on the land that had been, most of it had been other kinds of factories, had other sorts of industrial uses. So there were legacy contaminants in addition to the contemporary contaminants. And so you can see that this is like a residential street, and you can see just across that road, which is Richmond Terrace, or where you start having all the industrial properties. And oops, wrong direction. That's it. And a lot of the trucks that came to and from the port would use residential streets. So people were constantly dealing with noise and exhaust fumes all day and all night. Okay, so, and then on top of all of that, they had this notorious to some property that had been once owned by Archer Daniel Midland's company. And then in the 1930s, ADM had agreed to allow one of their warehouses on the site to, they leased it to the US government, and they were using it as part of the Manhattan Project. So uranium was coming in from the Belgian Congo, and they were allowing it to be stored in this warehouse before it got shipped off to other places to make the, to work on making the atom bomb. But at some point there had been a spill, and a large quantity of uraniums, either they don't know if it leaked or it spilled, but somehow it got into the grounds that you can see behind that green fence. And then it was covered with topsoil and paved over. And even though they found in the 1980s and then again in the 2000s high levels of uranium on the site, it was never remediated, and it just sort of sat there, but enclosed by this fence, and in an area that flooded often. As you can see from that picture, that's the flooding around that site. I am happy to report that they just started remediation on that site in December. I think it was in December, and it's supposed to be done in another couple months. So that was a really, really long battle though. So the Kilvan Coal itself, that water body that you saw, let me go back to my map, or here's a good picture of it, is part of an underwater Superfund site that contains Agent Orange, dioxins, and other heavy metals. So on rainy days, the waters overflow the banks of the Kilvan Coal and flood local areas. And that combines, of course, with the other toxins like from the industries on the waterfront, and it can, people drive through it. It can come all the way up. Sometimes it comes up through the sewers and forms street flooding. So people who live in this area are very concerned about the existing industries, existing contaminants. And they're also, of course, very concerned about climate change, because as more storms come, as sea levels rise, they get more flooding, and they're really worried about what that flooding consists of. So, and they can tell that they're constantly, their basements, might flood, and every year they feel like the floods in the basements get a little higher, and they're having to raise their stuff higher up off the floor. So also in this area of the North Shore of Staten Island, it's got the lowest income rates, highest rates of African Americans, Hispanic populations, recent migrants. In fact, it's a very diverse area that has migrants from all different parts of the world. So it's not what a lot of people, when they think about Staten Island, they think about the other 2/3 of Staten Island, which is what they call the South and really mid-island and the southern part of the island, which are more predominantly white and middle class, although that's changing as well. But this is an area that looks much more like other parts of New York City, demographically. So there's this huge contrast between something like that wheel project and the future that it envisioned and the realities of what life was like on the North Shore. And that contrast also extended to other parts of New York City that were becoming greened. So just to give you a quick amount of background on my own work. So I started studying environmental justice and environmental racism about 20 plus years ago. And I worked, my first book was on environmental justice activists in the US South. And I was looking at a small community of former sharecroppers in Augusta, Georgia. And it was a little neighborhood that was surrounded by polluting facilities. And they had come to realize that they were being contaminated by these facilities and started organizing for environmental justice, really based on their experiences as civil rights organizers. So I was really looking at that link between civil rights activism and environmental justice activism, and also what their relationships were like with more sort of mainstream environmental groups. So just to give you a little background, so that was, you know, a lot has happened since I did that study. And, you know, the idea of environmental justice has kind of much more on the radar, I think, of the general population. Certainly it's much more on the radar of federal and state legislators. However, the statistics remain about the same as they were when I started. And these are some fairly recent statistics that you can see. And again, if you look back from when they first started studying this stuff, which was in the 1990s, it really hasn't changed that much. So basically, here's another one. So basically race, and that's race, not class, is the biggest predictor of whether you're going to live in a polluted neighborhood. And of course, there are all kinds of health implications associated with that. So the reasons for these disparities, for this kind of environmental disparities, are rooted in interlocking systems of historic and ongoing racial injustice, which include barriers in access to housing, employment, education, criminal justice, access to healthcare. So all of these things kind of interlock and combine to produce the uneven geographies that we see across this country. And this is something that we see across the entire country. It's really not just about like the US South. As you can see, I studied it in New York City. It's pretty much everywhere that you go. And it's related to property values, but they don't tell the whole story. So in 2007, I moved to New York City. I had done my graduate work here, and I moved back here for a job, take my job at CUNY. And I had just finished my project in the South, and it was this new kind of era at the time of sustainability in New York City. So everywhere, well, Mayor Michael Bloomberg released his Plan NYC, which you may or may not be familiar with, but it was the first kind of big sustainability plan for New York City. It was a big deal at the time, and he was known as like the Green Mayor. And there were 127 separate initiatives in this for accommodating the city's population growth, while also retaining a commitment to environmental sustainability. And so when I first heard about this, it seemed really promising. The activists that I'd been working with have been talking about sustainability since the 90s. And it was like this term of their, you know, that I've associated with them had been picked up now and was becoming part of policy. So I was really interested to see if this was going to help, because I knew that there were some very long-standing and well-regarded environmental justice groups in New York City. And I wanted to see if this was actually going to help them further their cause. So really I really wanted to look at what were the intersections between environmental justice and the new greener New York City. Because everywhere there were bike lanes going in, there were green buildings going up, farmers markets, hybrid taxis, a lot of things that are here now that we sort of take for granted. And all kinds of waterfront neighborhoods were being transformed into luxury neighborhoods, you know, with high-end commercial and residential properties. So this kind of intersection, or let's say relationship between high-end redevelopment and greening initiatives is what I call environmental gentrification. A lot of people use that term, so that's kind of my very brief definition of it. And in my book, I break it down and identify 3 different types of environmental gentrification. So the first one, is the one that most people are familiar with, which is green gentrification. which is the kind of refurbishing or creation of new parks. And that then become associated with high-end redevelopment. So that's Greenpoint Landing, that's still being built. You know, I mean, some of it's up, it's ongoing, and that's one example. So you can see it's a little blurry because I expanded the picture, but there are green roofs on those towers. There's a lot of green space in between them. There's like, I think kayaking, you know, this was all the vision, kayaking and all kinds of recreation and things like that. And there's definitely affordable housing there, but there's also a lot of luxury housing there. So the thing is that, of course, everybody wants these green amenities. And so a lot of the environmental justice activists have been asking for parks to be refurbished and for better green space for many years. And then what I found was that they had been fighting for these things, and they finally would come like, okay, now we're going to get, you know, the restoration of Marcus Garvey Park, or we're going to get a new waterfront park up at 135th. But they also came along with gentrification, which really was a paradoxical situation for a lot of these activists, because they didn't want to fight against something that they really needed for their neighborhood, but they also didn't want to be displaced in the process. So in the book, I kind of go into some of the history of park development and property values, which I'm going to skip over for now. But you know, there is certainly a long history of that. It's not like a new thing that, you know, we can see that along Fifth Avenue near Central Park, right? Those have always been mansions, not always, but since the creation of Central Park, that's where the very wealthy people wanted to live. What has changed over the years, I think, is that these public-private partnerships where the city puts in some money and private developers put in money, and that's how you get something like Brooklyn Bridge Park. And that sort of sets up the dynamic slightly differently. And that's how parks are maybe not the capital funds all the time, but that's how they're maintained and operated. Or you have something like the High Line, which was a lot of, you know, very much a donor-based project with the idea that it was going to pay off to people who invested in it, you know, by being able to build condos, and there were, you know, incentives. If you wanted to be able to build a higher density condo around there, then you had to give money to the High Line. You could give money to the High Line, and it would offset that. It would give you the allowance to build more. So there's this kind of very tight relationship now between development and park development, which the effect of that would be to have more parks and more recently upgraded parks in wealthier neighborhoods. The other thing that happens is that even when the public parks are restored, like, for example, Marcus Garvey Park or Morningside, the rules tend to change, because if the neighborhood property values are starting to elevate and the demographics of the neighborhood are changing, then they kind of crack down on what you can do in the park, what time, you know, how late it stays open. And so people who've been using the parks for recreation for many, many years feel like they're suddenly being kind of shut out of it, or they have to pay to rent space to have that family reunion, let's say, that they have had for years. So these things become really contentious. I'm going to skip to the second kind of environmental gentrification, which is industrial gentrification. And that's a kind of, refers to the greening of manufacturing spaces. And so this was, again, another initiative, I would say, goes back to Bloomberg, who was really initially in his mayoralty was doing a lot to transform former industrial spaces into commercial and residential areas, because, you know, the city had become a real estate based economy by that point. We didn't need these industrial spaces. They weren't being really used. They were derelict, and they could, you know, get much more out of them to make them residential and commercial properties, which makes a lot of sense. But at a certain point after the 2008 recession, Bloomberg started to be criticized for taking away too much manufacturing. So now it seemed like there were no jobs for people who were what we call low-skilled workers, partly because there was no, all of the manufacturing, it seemed like, had disappeared from New York City. So he set up some new initiatives to retain manufacturing spaces and to create some new manufacturing spaces, but this time they would be cleaner and greener. So that's how we got things like the Brooklyn Navy Yard, Industry City, the Army Terminal. So all these kind of redevelopments of old manufacturing spaces into, maker spaces and artisan spaces and all of that stuff. The thing is that when you map it out, you find that most of these spaces are in gentrifying neighborhoods, or maybe they're on the edge of a gentrifying neighborhood. Like there's a lot going on in Gowanus with this right now too. So it's manufacturing, but it's a certain kind of manufacturing that actually, when I looked at the numbers, doesn't actually employ that many people, because these are small businesses. And they often only have a few people maybe working minimum wage on the back end. And the rest of it is people who are selling or designing or things like that. So it's not necessarily targeted to the traditional kind of manufacturing blue collar worker. And it becomes another amenity that sort of helps promote the neighborhood to gentrifiers, because now you can just go to, Industry City and there's all the stuff going on there. You can get your, artisan pickles or whatever right around the corner from your house. So again, it's something that could be really good and seems to provide much needed things that people need in the city, but then it gets skewed towards this kind of particular population. Okay, and the third kind of gentrification that I talk about is, I call it brown gentrification, which is the cleanup of brownfield sites. So brownfield sites are properties that are thought to be contaminated, underused, abandoned sites that exist throughout the city. There's hundreds and hundreds of them. They could be an old gas station, an old factory, anything that seems like it might have contaminants associated with it. And the idea is that they are thought to impede development because you have to clean them up to standard in order to redevelop them. And most developers don't want to spend that money. It's also a liability for them. So this program, the Brownfield program, started on the federal level to help incentivize development, because it would allow developers to write off the cost of remediation on their taxes, and also kind of gave them like a liability. It limited their liability for the site afterwards. So New York City became the first city under Bloomberg again to start its own brownfield program, a locally subsidized program. And so this, so the thing about the brownfield program, it was also something that environmental justice activists were really happy about and had been asking for, because a lot of what they do is try to get contaminated sites cleaned up in their neighborhoods. And they thought this would be a great mechanism to do it. But the thing with this mechanism is that it's tied to developers. So it's an incentive for redevelopment. And even though that redevelopment is, well, sometimes it can be anything. And sometimes, might get some extra subsidies if you say it's for a public good. But what that public good is can be really fuzzy, as long as you get enough kind of community members to sign off and say it's a public good, then that's what they consider it. So for example, there was like a brownfield site near Yankee Stadium that was redeveloped and became a hotel. And, the idea was, well, this hotel will supply jobs for people in the neighborhood, so therefore it's a public good. So there's a lot of ways that you can kind of construe these things without really understanding whether they actually are going to hire local people. Like there's nothing that, you don't necessarily get held to that. So here's an example in Gowanus. This is the Gowanus Whole Foods that was a former factory, and they were able to turn it into a Whole Foods market. And so a lot of what happens with the retail, like redevelopment of brownfields. Now, sometimes brownfield sites are redeveloped for actual public purposes, like they become parks and things. But when they're redeveloped for these kind of private purposes, which also often happens, they skew again towards a particular, they become part of a redevelopment, neighborhood redevelopment or neighborhood gentrification, and skew towards more affluent populations, their reuses. So so that becomes another way that this kind of thing that sounds like it's a sustainable project, that sounds like it's meant for everybody, again, becomes an instrument for private development. And this is where I'm going to talk about some more recent research. So we did, I worked with some colleagues at Queens College and at the CUNY School of Public Health to map out the city-funded brownfield sites. We found that 48% of the completed sites were located in central Brooklyn, mostly in Williamsburg and Greenpoint. And also there has been a lot recently in the Gowanus Canal. And so, for example, after that, Whole Foods went into the Gowanus, median rent increased by 17.4%, and home values went up by 6.1%. And then they went even higher after that. So this is a map that we've created where we created an index of gentrification. This is between 2002 and it says 2019 in here. We actually moved it up to 2021 recently, but it's similar. It didn't change dramatically. That's what I'm saying, by adding another 2 years. So the darker shaded areas are the areas of higher gentrification, and our index had 4 or 5 variables. They were increase in rent, increase in education, increase, I think a decrease in Black and Hispanic population, increase in white population, and increase in income. And then, so we kind of developed that index, we mapped it over the city, and then we mapped out the sites that are potential brownfield sites, because there's every time any part of New York City goes through a rezoning, they have to do environmental investigation and determine whether there's what they call an E-designated site, which is like a site that might need environmental remediation if it gets redeveloped. So the blue dots on here are all the sites that have potential environmental problems. And this is just from when things have been either upzoned or downzoned. So it's not a comprehensive look, but it's the closest we could get. And then the green sites are the sites that for city-funded brownfield redevelopment programs. So you can really see that the city-funded programs, the green ones, cluster in these areas that are either undergoing redevelopment now or have undergone redevelopment in the past 10 or 15 years. And you can see how it maps on to the gentrification shading. And to give you a little bit to kind of bring it back to Staten Island, that's a close-up. So on Staten Island, we got a lot of blue dots, right? Because we have all of those contaminated sites. And then there's just a smattering, a couple of green dots. So there's just a couple of sites that have been actually cleaned up through the city program. And that's because Staten Island is not, or the North Shore of Staten Island is not really an area that is gentrifying, even though there's been lots of plans for that, which I'll talk about in a minute, but it doesn't really ever take off there, or it hasn't so far. Not a lot of people want to move out to Staten Island. So the problem is then there's no mechanism for cleaning up the contaminated sites. Like they have just as many as any other neighborhood, but because there's no kind of potential there, or developers don't see a real potential there, the sites remain uncleaned. And so that's really the big problem, as I see it, with the brownfield program. And this also gives you a better look at Lower Manhattan and Brooklyn. What I did, besides collecting all of this kind of like data from up here, was to follow, basically I worked with environmental justice activists on Staten Island's North Shore, and I just followed them around to lots of meetings. And they went to a lot of meetings during the 10 years that I worked with them. There were public hearings, there were visioning sessions. The city was always coming out with kind of plans for what to do with the North Shore, transportation plan, redevelopment plan, all kinds of plans. And they always wanted community members to give their input and to prioritize things. And we would sit and take a budget and divide it up according to people's priorities. But, people were, what all this was going on, the people I worked with were incredibly aware that what was happening was that while they were sitting around kind of going to these meetings and making plans, that nothing was changing about the contamination of their neighborhood, but all of these other neighborhoods in New York were being cleaned up and green. So as one said, wonderful hipster havens are created, waterfront parks, other diversion to the residents of the new luxury units. Where do the displaced heavy industrial firms go? Bottom line, the areas with people of color, people without tremendous economic resources, are paying the price for these projects. While our taxes support these changes, we do not share in the benefits and find ourselves here on Staten Island, once again, a dumping ground for the city's unwanted garbage. And so what she's saying is that another kind of phenomenon that I found was that there's this direct relationship between, a lot of people, when they study gentrification, they study what's happening in gentrifying neighborhoods, which is really important, and to find out, who's being displaced, how is the neighborhood changing, and all of that is very important. But what is less often studied is what happens to non-gentrifying neighborhoods. And so that's why I spent a lot of my time, as it turned out, on Staten Island, because I wanted to see what's happening to a place like the North Shore as all these other places start to green. And what I found was they were getting more industrial stuff. So as you transform manufacturing uses, let's say like on the Brooklyn waterfronts, no longer are you going to have heavy industry. Now you're going to have, maybe if anything, you're going to have these small manufacturing spaces. So, but the city still needs some heavy industrial uses. So you still need waste transfer stations, you still need sewage treatment plants, you still need, certain actual manufacturing businesses to contribute to the city's economy. And these are getting concentrated into areas that are not gentrifying. And that's what I found was happening on the North Shore. In fact, there was this kind of, sometimes it felt like there was a competition between these plans that were coming out of city planning, which wanted to like make it another kind of Brooklyn, and then all these new industrial uses that kept coming up for permits, and both were happening simultaneously, which was very confusing because it felt like people didn't know which one to oppose, first, high-end development plans or, these industrial uses. It turns out that the industrial uses kind of won out at the time, because in 2013, the city designated a new, what they call an IBZ, an industrial business zone, along the west and north shores of Staten Island. That's areas that actually are designated for heavy manufacturing. And that was happening right in the same area where they were also calling for redevelopment, and actually even for brownfield development. So there was this enormous conflict, which I can talk more about in the questions and answers, between what was going to happen on that area. But again, the industrial business zone won out. So in the past few years, they've had two new cement plants have gone in there. They've talked a lot about expanding the port. They've talked about putting in a new, I think they did put in, no, that didn't work. They were going to put in a new kind of waste treatment facility. There's a lot of transportation depots and stuff. So the pollution problem, the kind of situation there hasn't really improved. And it seems like it's become more of a concentrated area for heavy industry and pollution. So, so one thing that I found was, despite the fact that the people I worked with, these activists, were always going to meetings and public hearings and public testimonies and, you know, writing things in, very little changed. And so they got very frustrated with the participatory process, which seems to kind of line up with sustainability as this kind of citizen participation, public participation. But it for them anyway, in this case, they very rarely did the plans change. And as one woman said, she often said this, it was called a steering committee because we were steered. So they would find themselves on these committees, but without really very much power to change the direction of them. So the thing is that, which caused a lot of them, frankly, to quit activism. Like they just kind of felt like it was either their sanity or get out entirely, which was really sad to see. But the point is really that the local residents that I worked with knew exactly what the situation was. They knew how what was happening in their neighborhood related to what was happening in the rest of the city. They had lots of ideas about how to make the situation better. They had lots of great ideas about how to protect their neighborhoods from flooding. They also knew that increased flooding was going to bring increased chances of increased environmental risk to them because of the contaminants. But they weren't really taken very seriously or listened to in any kind of meaningful way. And so instead, they were often just kind of tried to, they would be, the idea was just to get like a rubber stamp, kind of check a box, like, okay, we had a public hearing, now we're going to go forward. So they ended up, you know, sometimes just resisting anything that had the word sustainability on it, even though that was really their mission, which again was this contradiction. But I think that their struggles to call out and to demand a more equitable form of sustainability really lie at the heart of what is going to be our city's collective future. So these kind of short-sighted development and sustainability initiatives, if they don't protect everybody, then really none of us, we're all in trouble. And I'm going to just end with a quote, another quote from one of the activists I work with, who wrote this to her city council members and her borough president's office and her state senators. We plod along as if we have all the time in the world for these problems to be resolved and come to a reasonable conclusion. And to be honest, we don't have a lot of time. We are on the same clock as the developers, businesses, and Mother Nature. It's whoever gets here first. And I think I can just take questions and we can have a discussion.
Thank you, Professor, for this insightful talk. Yeah, we are ready.
Let's turn this on. Fine, I'll put it on the map. Okay. Any questions? Yeah, so I do have some folks that I know that are working in Miami, and this has been this idea of well, of climate gentrification also is something that they're studying a lot in Miami because there's so many climate related projects going on there. It's kind of on the forefront in some ways of resilience, but they're finding that people want to, that also these, well, first of all, it costs a lot of money to make these to do this resiliency projects, and that they find a similar pattern where the areas that are getting protected, either that raises the property values and then they attract more wealthy residents, or they're protecting. I think what's happening there is more that they're shoring up like certain low income neighborhoods, but they're gentrifying at the same time, so that the most well protected neighborhoods are also turning out to be the most affluent. So there's a relationship there, which is very similar kind of thing. I mean, I think, they're trying to not do that. There's a lot of talk here among city leaders, and I'm hoping the situation is improving from what I've described, where they're talking about doing more projects in, I've been mostly involved with resiliency projects at this point in Queens. And, they're really looking at the areas that flooded badly, and I think it was Ida, and trying to, work on street flooding and some of the areas that are lower profile or less gentrifying. And so hopefully that'll happen. I mean, the people who live in those neighborhoods, feel like it's not enough and it's not happening soon enough. And so, but they've, I think the city is more aware of this issue, and so they're talking about it more, which is good start. Yeah. The map or the index? Yeah, so these are the variables. This is the kind of an early version of the index that we created, and these would be the variables. We went by rent, we went by income, we went by age as an indication of gentrification, education, and then proportion that, and these are all changes in populations. So what happened, what we found with the index was like a place like Tribeca didn't show up at all on our index because it had already changed, because we were looking at changes from, there's a typo in here, it's 2002 to, first it was 2016, then 2019, then 2021. So like some areas are wealthy, but they haven't changed, so they didn't show up. But we really wanted to look at degrees of gentrification. So we put these variables together and then check them against property values, which is a very tricky measure, which is why we didn't include it in the index. But when we did, look, I didn't do the statistics, so I can speak very basically about it, but my colleague who's a statistician did it. But he thought it checked out, we have an article about it if you want to look into the details of what he did with the index. But there are a few of these indexes. At the time we started it, we didn't see that many out there, that, a lot of them had one or two variables, which we thought was surprising when you're measuring gentrification. So we wanted to do one that had more variables in it that hopefully could be applied to other cities. I'm sorry. That's a great question. So the thing about it is there's still an as of right, and that hasn't gone away. And so I don't know the specific answer, but I imagine there are, because the as of right clause is that if you have an industrial business or manufacturing business and you're just kind of, it's changing owners, but not changing uses or not expanding in any kind of significant way, then the permit remains. So you can just kind of change the owner. And if it's still, it's going from manufacturing use to manufacturing use, then it retains that permit. And the problem is that because our zoning law, we have residential areas on top of manufacturing areas practically, or really side by side. And that goes all the way back to the Industrial Revolution, when the city leaders thought it was a good thing for workers to live in walking distance to the factories. And it was in some ways, but unfortunately not in others. But we still have housing and industry like right up against each other in a lot of neighborhoods with very little buffer. And because of this as of right clause, a lot of that just kind of keeps perpetuating. And that's like a big thing that the activists I work with wanted to change. But I think in the IBZs, you can still have that kind of like mix. Mhm. Yeah, well, I would say not so much in my, well, a few things happened in my research, but more things have happened outside of, like there was um the rezoning in Inwood that didn't happen, and that was, I think, the result of a lot of community activism. There was the Amazon thing that didn't go through. There was actually a big fight in Gowanus over where they were going to treat the waste from the Gowanus Canal. And it first they were going to do it in Carroll Gardens. Then those people got really upset. And at the time, the neighborhood was like more in flux. There was still some very old Italian families living there and would be considered lower middle to working class, as well as like the neighborhood was turning over. But anyway, they opposed it. Then they were going to take it to Red Hook, where they also opposed it, which was an interesting fight because it was people in the Red Hook houses, right, which is public housing, but also some developers were involved in that one because they, it wasn't going to be good for their business to be treating all this waste. And then it ended up that they were going to treat it in Staten Island on the North Shore. And then because Staten Island, I didn't even touch on this, but Staten Island is what it is. The owner of the plant got in a lot of legal trouble. I think he shot somebody, and so the whole thing fell through, which was one of the real pleasures of working out there. It's an interesting place. So that now they're shipping it off to some other state to treat it. But that's part of the problem with, with environmental justice, especially in a place like New York, where there's only so much land, there's only so many places to do things. So you can fight it off in one place and then it goes to another place. And so that's one of the things they deal with. So that's an excellent question. So there is some of that. So on the state level, they've kind of cracked down a little bit more. So there's a state brownfield program too. And there they try to be a little more restrictive about the uses, how it can be reused. So they don't want it being reused for luxury housing, for example. So they have limits on like the kind of housing you could build or the density of it, things like that. On the city level though, there's like a bonus program where you can get better incentives if you do something that has a public use, which a lot of people have been able to get around. But they kind of really want it to be for private development, so they don't, yeah. I would like to think so for sure. I mean, I like the concept and I think a lot of, I think it can. I think though that if you're doing just green enough, like there has to be a lot of will on the part of the city and businesses and honestly nonprofits to make sure that housing stays affordable. And I think in that case, that kind of thing, it's really about maintaining housing affordability. I mean, so for example, I have one of my doctoral students just did a project on under de Blasio. He kind of had a fund to refurbish a bunch of playgrounds in underserved neighborhoods. And they did refurbish these playgrounds, like that project, they sort of spread it around. It was not tied to development. Some of the neighborhoods ended up redeveloping a little bit, but not all of them. And people are pretty happy. My students studied, how people felt about the changes to their parks, but these are like tiny little parks that definitely got upgrades and people felt like they could spend more time in them. They wanted to, but that's what it did. It created like a nicer park for that neighborhood without raising prices. But I think when they're talking about just green enough, they mean a little bit more, so you could maybe do it in a very limited way. But if you want to do something more large scale, then I think it's really about maintaining the affordability. And there is a project in Washington, D.C., in Anacostia, which is a historically Black neighborhood, low income, and they're doing like a kind of High Line type of project there. And what happened was all of these nonprofits, local nonprofits and national ones and foundations pooled money and they created a land trust right around the park so that they can preserve affordability in the areas that are right there near it, so that kind of model, I think it seems like a really good one for making sure that some kind of big development doesn't displace people. I mean, it's still, we'll see how it goes, but it seemed like a good idea. Sorry, one more. Yeah, sure. I'm like, how much time do we have? So, I think that, again, I think that what happened was that, okay, this is what I saw was that the agencies that came in didn't really want, they didn't want to go too deep with it. They didn't really want that much input necessarily. So because these things are very complicated and where they're getting the funding, there's lots of restrictions, like maybe they're getting some federal money and I studied this traffic triangle in Harlem on 116th and Adam Clayton Powell and right by the library. And it was like a little traffic triangle. It was federal money and it was to like plant it and make it into a little park. And it turned out that the people in the neighborhood just were like, no, we're not doing this, because they were concerned about gentrification. And they didn't even though it was like this dusty old grimy place with a couple benches on it where, nobody really, not that many people wanted to hang out anyway, but they were scared of what would happen if the park came in. And there was no there wasn't a way that they could find a compromise, that I think because the funding was for like a particular thing and they just said, okay, we're not going to do it. We'll go somewhere else. And so I think they repaired the benches and planted some more plants and then it didn't happen. So it's kind of, I mean, I think that there just has to be more of a will to actually, or more ways to be flexible enough to take input seriously. Another good example would be what happened down on the Lower East Side with the restoration of the park down there, the East River Park. And they had all of these visioning sessions and people participated a lot and they did change the plan for it. And people felt really good about how the plan had changed and people were really feeling like their input mattered. But then because of funding considerations, they kind of just like overnight changed it and went with a totally different plan. So, you know, I understand it sort of from both sides, but it would be nice if there was a way that we'd have everything. Yeah. Yeah. Because I think the effect of it on people when they put that much time in, I don't know if that's considered either, that if they're going to put that much time and devote that much energy and, you know, like they really feel like they should get something back. Okay.
Thank you for wonderful presentation. Thank you. And yeah, lecture. Please make sure to join us next week at the same time for our leveraging our outside. Let's have a meeting. Working for it, and they're acting. They both. So
Thank you. Thank you so much.